We were listening to Cuba's Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez Parrilla. This foreign minister also was presenting a draft resolution and submitting it to vote, and also in this case, the Assembly to report on the impacts of the U.S. economic blockade against the island and submitting that draft resolution for voting. Parrilla referred to the financial losses that this inhumane policy causes to Cuba, amounting to over 15 million daily and impacting paramount sectors such as health, education, food, and national development as well. The government official also referred to this genocidal policy strained Cuba's economy in the aftermath of COVID-19 and the current worldwide recession. He stressed this policy prevents Cuba from acquiring elemental resources and goods such as foodstuffs, fuel, medicines, and other basic items. So it does not only harm the Cuban government but the people. Parrilla reminded Cuba has to pay more and in advance for products that can be easily acquired by other countries, as closed wholesale markets fears U.S. fines. The diplomat also stressed Cuba's government bets on a civilized and better understanding between both nations, but the blockade still strains bilateral relations and outrules any possibility of cordial ties between the nations. Parrilla also underlined Cuba's government strategies to cope with the current situation in the country as enhancing entrepreneurs, communications, and youth actors. Also, let's remember some of the aspects that this inhumane policy and also this policy imposes on Cuba. The blockade was imposed on Cuba 60 years ago and over 60 years ago and has been straining Cuba's economy and Cuba's relations with other countries since then. This draft resolution is being presented by the Cuba's government since 1992, 30th time. By 30 years, Cuba has been presenting this draft resolution and submitting it to vote and presenting also the effects of this policy against Cubans and against Cuba's people. Every time that Cuba has presented this draft resolution, Israel, as an ally of the U.S., has voted against also the U.S., but there has been changes in several votations, in several votes in this UN General Assembly debate on the resolution. In any case, in 2021, Brazil and Colombia voted against the resolution and also supported the U.S. Let's remember that back in 2021, the governments of Brazil and Colombia were allies and aligned to the U.S. policies under Jair Bolsonaro's administration and Ivan Duque's administration in 2021. So they were against Cuba's pledge and Cuba's claim to end the blockade. That corresponds to their policies and also to their rapprochement to the island. And also this vote, let's remember, does not have a binding power, as the U.S. is not obliged to lift the blockade against Cuba, but Cuba remains voting and remains presenting the draft resolution every year as a symbolic act to denounce the policy and to report on the strains on Cuba because of this inhumane blockade imposed by the U.S. In any case, this is a way that upheaves Cuba's morale in the world and also shows the support for the island against this inhumane policy. The vote, as we were saying, does not have this binding power. And let's remember, the blockade not only limits Cuba, but also those who need to do business with the island and also the U.S. and Cuban families. Let's remember that in any case, the Cuba's families have many relatives and many other parts of their families in the U.S. as migration and the closeness between the two countries, and this provokes that Cuba cannot implement an ordinate and also a coherent and coercive measure, a coherent policy of migration to the U.S. So this ignites and bolsters illegal migration, and also really jeopardizing and dangerous migration by land and sea to the U.S. This causes not only deaths and damages to Cuban people, also causes that the families are divided and are apart because of these policies, as Trump's government seized the consular services in the island and closed the embassy of the country in the island, an embassy that was reopened and refunctioning under Obama's administration. Also, under Trump administration, he halted the remittances to the island, so he cut all the ways that the families in the U.S. could send money to the families and the relatives in Cuba. And the U.S. government has been saying that was a way to cut the government and to preventing Cuba's government from acquiring funds. In any case, it's not only harming the government, it's harming the people and the common people who was receiving the remittances and receiving the support, the financial support from their families abroad. Also, let's remember, this prevents also the U.S. citizens to come to Cuba freely to enjoy Cuba's services and maybe Cuba's possibilities of education, health, and other sectors. Also, let's remember, this prevents U.S. citizens to come to Cuba not only to do business and not only to visit the country, to also learn about Cuba's history, to learn about Cuba's culture, and strengthens the relations between the two peoples, not only the governments, the peoples who need communication and who need also bridges and who need also to cooperate because we are neighbors, because of the closeness in geography and the closeness in culture. Also, let's remember that one of the promises and the pledges of the Biden administration was to end and to close this inhumane policy. But so far, the Biden administration has done nothing to lift the blockade and nothing to ease these policies for Cuba, and it keeps listening to Cuba's Miami-based anti-governmental and anti-Cuba people who lives in there, and to, as we know, they have the power in Florida and they have the power to move the strings and to be the puppeteer behind this policy. And now we have the voting results in favor 185 countries. The abstentions were 2 and voted against 2 countries. As we were saying, this is a landslide victory for Cuba's morale and for Cuba's value in the world and in front of the world. In any case, as we were saying, this is voting has no binding power. Cuba has only a symbolic power, holding a symbolic power, facing this vote in the United Nations against the inhumane policy, against the blockade imposed by the U.S.